Good morning. In our last video, we took a look at the powers of the executive branch. With this particular video, I want us to look at the limits or checks on the president's power, as well as how those limits are affected by party or ideological affiliation. Just to clarify what I mean by ideology is just that as a liberal or a conservative, am I going to use these limits on executive power equally, or am I more likely to use those limits if I'm a liberal against a Republican president, or vice versa? What's worth noting is that there are a large number of checks on presidential power. You can see here, Congress can override a president's veto. They can impeach the president. They can determine that we're not going to fund this particular presidential agenda item. You might have put it in place years ago, but we're not going to provide money for it anymore. They can also, in the Senate, say, no, we're not going to allow you this particular judicial appointment, just as Mitch McConnell did with Merrick Garland. Federal courts can decide actions of the presidency as unconstitutional, that we'll be speaking more on here in just a bit. Now, remember I said in the last video that the president had great hiring and firing ability for the heads of cabinet departments as well as the executive agencies working for those departments, but he does not control those working under those heads. And sometimes those bureaucrats might not have the same interests as the president or those he appointed at the top of those. And that can do a lot to stall or even stop a president's agenda. And lastly, public opinion. If the public does not have your back, it's very difficult for the president to push things forward on the agenda that he has. But a key thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the only way these limits have any power whatsoever in limiting the president's agenda is if they are actually taken. Recognize that, yes, Congress might have these abilities. Yes, the public might have these abilities. But if they don't exercise these abilities to check the president's power, then the president's power continues to expand unabated. Now, constitutionally, the 22nd Amendment was established during the Truman presidency in large part to ensure that a president was not elected more than twice again. And despite the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was elected by wide margins in every election that he was elected, particularly in 36, as well as I believe 44, the American people didn't feel too great about that kind of concentration of power. So they ultimately established the 22nd Amendment to limit the president to no more than 2 terms. And if he were vice president, he could serve for and was forced to take office of the presidency because the president died, like he did with Franklin Roosevelt. Then the vice president could serve 2 years as interim president and still be elected 2 times. So he could serve up to 10 years in office, with that being said. Moreover, after the Kennedy assassination, Congress got to work on creating the 25th Amendment to try to lay out the terms and the conditions under which a vice president could ultimately take office. And in the case of the vice president, because remember, sometimes there are threats on not just the president himself, but presidential succession as well. And this is where they really lay down who can ultimately take office after that. So it goes president, vice president, speaker of the House, and down from there. Believe it or not, they go down about 20 or 30 deep. So, and when they go into emergency operation mode, I forget the exact terminology for it, but the Secret Service is assigned to different parts of that lineage down from the president to try and ensure that someone can ultimately take the helm if the president and the various people after him are unable to. But a key part that's been relevant of late are the conditions in which a sitting president can be deemed unfit and ultimately removed from office. Much of that has been relevant to Trump's various antics. Again, maybe many of those pushes for the president being unfit are driven by liberals. And if so, is that a legitimate reason to call a president unfit for the presidency? I'll let you decide that. Of course, there's also been a lot of talk of Trump's impeachment. Now, I want to clarify the distinction between impeachment and removal. Recognize that presidents have been impeached before, but no president has ever been removed from office. So let's clarify. The House of Representatives needs a simple majority vote to impeach the sitting president. Okay, that happened under Andrew Johnson, it happened under Bill Clinton, and it happened under Donald Trump. But from there, it goes to the Senate. Okay, and the Senate has to vote on a 2/3 majority and ultimately to convict and remove the president from office. That has never happened. Andrew Johnson was one vote away. Okay, Clinton was nowhere near that, and Trump, it never even reached well, they didn't have witnesses. They did have a full vote, but it did not end up coming to pass. Okay, but that third step would be a full removal from office. It does get a bit more complicated, but these are the three main steps that I want you to know for now. Now, in 2018, there was a poll here done on whether or not President Trump should be impeached. What I'm curious and what I want you to be thinking about is how might these numbers affect Trump's power to carry out his agenda now, and how might it affect his chances to become elected again in 2020? We spoke briefly at the beginning about limits on executive power. Some other aspects that might impact those limits are whether or not the president is operating in what's called a divided government. Now, right now, we have a divided government, but in Trump's first term, it was not, just like Obama's first term was not a divided government. Okay? And what that means is that the Democrats might control Congress while the Republicans control the White House. That can lead to great difficulty in the president to set whatever agenda he sees fit. It also can limit his ability to serve in bully pulpit, because if the country is that divided, the media reporting on these various issues might pose some challenges to what the president is wanting as well. If, however, it's a unified government and the people have voted for the president overwhelmingly, the bully pulpit can be used quite effectively here. In addition to that, Congress might do workarounds or create new laws to stop executive orders or his signing statements there. And the media will help influence Congress in their decision to do so. And you can see that there's been an overwhelming amount of negative press coverage on the Trump administration. So the Democrats are ultimately trying to do just that. The media also, of course, plays a large role in public approval ratings, which has been alluded to at a few different times in the two videos so far on presidential power. But I want you to look at this particular number here. When Obama was elected into office, his approval ratings were fairly high at 64%. Okay? That allowed him to push forward his agenda with Obamacare. And recognize, though, again, it was a unified government at that time, so they did have the majority in Congress, and that allowed him to do that. Now, that's what typically constitutional scholars call, or political scholars call, use of political capital. After he ultimately pushed for Obamacare, it made it much harder for him to carry out the rest of his agenda afterwards, and that likely cost him some of these lower numbers there. So presidents have to think very carefully about what sort of agenda they're pushing forward, what kind of items they're pushing forward, because it can play a large part in their later success over the course of their one term or two terms. Now, one of the areas in which the presidents have been granted an enormous amount of power, both by Congress and the federal courts, is as commander-in-chief. Recognize that the president has at his disposal the FBI, which serves internationally. He has the CIA, which serves internationally, the National Security Agency, as well as a variety of different military staff members that can serve a massive amount of information. Granted, they're accountable to Congress, but that's just it. There's an intermediate step there. Congress has passed the War Powers Act, but no president has acknowledged its constitutionality, and the courts refuse to step in on this specific matter, but they have the authority to do so, and they have done so a number of times. They did it against President Truman in the Korean War, stopping his takeover of the steel plants in Ohio. Now, it's important to note where that power comes from. We can see here, or when those limits might come to pass. When the president acts in accordance with what it is that Congress has set up for laws, he is on the strongest constitutional ground and can ultimately move forward with great confidence and get a lot done with that regard. But there are other areas where the president might be operating without full congressional approval, but can still ultimately get some headway into this. Now, this specific intermediate area is the area in which President Obama was operating in when he signed the executive order of DACA, or Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. The reason why he was able to get away with that is Congress had not passed comprehensive immigration reform for decades. So he was able to sign executive order establishing DACA to try to ease some of the immigration policy on these specific individuals. And that's an important point. If, however, the president is operating without congressional approval, or there isn't basically a leg for him to stand on in terms of policies or laws that have been passed, he has the least constitutional ground to stand on. There is no law that he can point to. He cannot operate as an island there, and that's the key part. So there are frameworks on which they have to kind of stand on. Now, crises are obviously a big part of the presidency of different administrations, whether or not that's a mass shooting at a school, 9/11, or Katrina. You can see here that President Bush's approval rating shot up significantly, up to 90% after 9/11, because so many felt that he handled the incident with such compassion and care, and it gave him the authority to establish the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But shortly thereafter, within Katrina, and Katrina happened in late 2006, you can ultimately see those approval ratings plummeting, especially within minority communities. Many within the African American community felt that his incompetency in this matter led to the deaths of over 1,000 people, many of them African American, and that definitely hurt President Bush's standings there. Some argue that the same trend is happening with President Trump now with his COVID-19 policies there and how he's going about it or not going about it. I think we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see how that may be hurting him or helping him as the election winds up. We've spoken a lot about the president and the press, and it's worth noting here again why that becomes so important. Presidents have a mixed relationship with the press. Obama was viewed as a press darling there. Trump has not sometimes, and you can see how he's felt about that. He calls the press his enemy. It's an enemy of the American people. Now, his followers are handling that one way, but others are ultimately viewing that as a potential threat to the freedom of the press. And you can imagine the press is pushing back. But perhaps there's reasons for Trump taking the position that he is and how he's being portrayed by the press. And there's definitely a reason why Obama fought as hard as he did against the press and anyone within his administration leaking out information. But simply put, the press has a good deal of power within our country. And to sum up, we have anything from Congress's ability to override congressional vetoes or to push for the War Powers Act. But if it's purely happening on partisan grounds, as it was against Obama with Libya, or Trump in his actions against General Soleimani in Iraq, perhaps those limits aren't ultimately what they should be. And this is where we really want to think critically about, is our increasing partisanship causing problems with effective checks on presidential power? And I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope you found this informative.